Welcome, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the official podcast of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. Here we are committed to the practical application of knowledge so that we may develop ourselves to our true potential. Along with individual improvement, we seek to unite knowledge with action for the betterment of mankind. In order to accomplish our task, we facilitate dialogue and debate through literature and media, but most importantly, through lively conversations amongst individuals like you who are brilliant, experienced, and who maintain the ability to exercise sound judgment. This episode is the first in a series that will seek to explore the art of speechmaking and the science of oratory. Together, Preston and Jordan attempt to construct the ideal orator. We hope that you find this episode entertaining and instructive. Stay tuned for more videos, and please post your comments below, and if you can, subscribe. Thank you to wisdom, virtue, and victory. Enjoy. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is a podcast test for the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. And today I am with Preston Nieves, and we are executing an inquiry into the making of an orator. So basically, Preston, we understand that there's a significance in the orator, the speaker, the person who goes before society and tells them, the State of the Union, or gives them a new vision and sort of talks to the nation as a whole, because a speech is really the only way that you can reach the whole nation. It's been done since ancient times, and it's just a linchpin of government, of all governments, and it's something that not only helps you at the national level, but it can help you at any level, professionally or in class, with your assignments. And it's just a really important thing to talk about, because a lot of, unless you're taking a rhetoric course, you don't really get that education on how to be an orator. And there's a lot of good information out there. There's a lot of good information out there that will help you along your way. And one of the things that the Wisdom Factory does is we try to develop ourselves. And Preston, let's try to develop this skill of oratory real quick. So just off the back, who's your favorite speaker and why? Who do you look to when you
Well, I got to think about that one a little bit. I would say, can I have two? Because
You can have 12, Preston.
Okay. Because I'm going to say I have two, and one's not going to be politically correct, and I will preface this by saying obviously I hate the message of the non-politically correct one, the one who, and I'll talk about him second, because I want to lead with something that's going to be familiar to a lot of people. So the first speaker that I really say that I would like is Martin Luther King Jr. That he was one of my favorites, and one of the reasons is because he had emotion, but he was able to do that without losing the logical aspect. That what happened, he went up there, he made a lot of good metaphors, he spoke in a manner, in a style that was easy to follow, that conveyed that he really cared about the issue. He was able to get in depth enough where you understood what he was saying, but at the same time, he didn't lose you, and he knew how to just, speak just as long and just as in detail. And that overall, when you listen to an MLK speech, it's something, it's empowering, that he makes you want to see change. Now, the second person that I would say I like, and once again, I need to emphasize this, because there's people who will get mad when I say this. I like the speaking style, not the message. Adolf Hitler was and the reason why I say, now, the thing is with Adolf Hitler is that you have to understand the effectiveness of this rhetoric, because when you look at what he was able to do in getting people to follow him, think about it like this. He had a message that was complete bullshit, and yet he was able to get the entire German nation to follow him. Almost. There were dissenters, but not many. Why is that? Well, because Hitler, he was somebody who, when you listen to how powerful his speeches were, that when how he was able to appeal to such a wide range of emotions, he was able to get people fired up and to care about a cause. That with that power and with that style that he had, being able to kind of ignite a spark inside of people, those rhetorical strategies were extremely effective. And it's and that when you listen to that speaking style, there are things as much as we might not want to talk about this historical figure,
Yes.
there are things
Yes.
that can be learned from his speaking
I
style.
think that's exactly the point. Now, I don't want the listeners to be scared. Oh, he said Adolf Hitler, so you're triggered already. Now, I want you to pay attention. This is an intellectual debate, and what Preston has noticed and discovered is an important part of oratory, is that Hitler, whether you like him or not, he was effective. And I think why that is important is because what Preston is getting at is his ability to lead a nation forward, to have a vision and have the nation execute that vision. And he did that largely through his oratory and the way that he connected to the German people and got them to sort of build this superpower nation. Now, obviously, they were a force for evil, but what if you were Hitler for good? What if you were the same person who had the same repertoire, who had the same speaking style and the same power of speaking, but instead of doing evil and committing genocide, you wanted progress and peace, and you wanted to explore the new bounds of human achievement? I think that's what you're trying to say here.
A good thought experiment that we could kind of use, like imagine if, say, obviously everybody's favorite politician is going to be different, but two examples that I've heard that are pretty popular. Imagine if, say, Rand Paul or Bernie Sanders had their views, but the speaking style of Hitler.
Right.
How persuasive would that be? That would be something else,
Yeah.
And that what it is that I think that, that there are definitely, when you're thinking about whatever it is that you stand for, because obviously one of the reasons why I named two politicians, one on the right and one on the left, is because I recognize that people have a very broad and diverse set of political priorities. What the direction I want to see the country go might not be the same that you want to see the country go.
Right.
But regardless of what happens, I think if you want to have an effective movement, and if you want to make sure that that movement ultimately leads in the direction that's good, that your interests actually get achieved, that people actually support you, that you don't hit a bunch of brick walls in opposition, that the way to do that is that you have to communicate to people in a way that, that the message reaches them and that the message inspires them.
Now, when you talk about Martin Luther King and Hitler and what they did, there was actually something that's very similar to both of them. And that is, for Martin Luther King, he was the king at it. What he did.
Oh, yeah.
When he spoke and he poured his heart out to these people, the reception that he get, they weren't clapping, they were screaming, they were crying, they were jumping up in the air, having their hands in the air. Like it affected people so powerfully that they wanted to then prove to Dr. King that they didn't just take that speech in vain, that they understood his call to action and they went forth and they did it. And I think that's what Hitler did best in Germany, is he got people to make little sacrifices for themselves, whether it was rationing or whether it was sharing property or hiring, or he got business people to commit to not simply living for the profit motive and for greed, but to sort of participate in building the German nation, even if they had to sacrifice their own pockets. And so the big thing that you see, the underlying trend there, is this call to action and the duty and getting people to do something. And that is why oratory is important. So now I just want to go ahead, now that we sort of have a baseline of why this should be explored, let's go ahead and explore and do this little mental exercise that we've thought up that we think is the best way to sort of help your average student, your average listener, whoever it might be, hearing this right now, to sort of incorporate these things into their life and become a more effective speaker. And that is, what me and Preston are going to try to do is construct an orator. So it's like if you had a game and you were able to create your own character and you had all their attributes, whether it would be, intellect, whether it would be wisdom, or whether it would be compassion, or whether it would be, their beauty, or how tall they are, or how do they look, their presence, their energy, their charisma. How would you construct the perfect orator? And I think the first question that we have to ask ourselves, Preston, is, are orators born or are they made? Are there some people who just have a natural ability to be able to captivate people with their words? Or is this something that you could sort of develop? But if you don't have, like if you have a lisp, or if you just don't have a powerful voice, or if you just don't have those hawk eyes, there are a lot of things that you're born with. People in the NBA, they're born tall, they're born good, they're born, like with a capability to be athletic. There's a lot of areas where you have to have a certain level of natural gift. So is that true, or do you see that this is more something that anybody can develop?
Well, I would definitely say that, well, first of all, I'm going to kind of go from simple to complicated, because I think that there is definitely a more complex answer to this that's a little bit more definitive and more conclusive. But to put it simply, I would say, that, first of all, that it is a little bit of both. And what I'm going to get into is, I think, the degree of which is more important. It is a little bit of both. Now, obviously, there are some people who just innately seem to have a talent, for speaking. Like, there's a lot of people I've met who are like that. Some people have said that about me because, like, from a very early age, I love to talk, and I, would get people fired up with some of the stuff I said. So I do definitely think that there is a component. But when you look at some of these rhetorical strategies we have in front of us, things like invention, arrangement, style, memory, that there definitely are some techniques that, whether you're a good or bad speaker to start with, you can use to improve yourself, to be a little bit more persuasive. And right. I have some firsthand experience with that. Like when I was competing in congressional debate in high school, that I went from mediocre to good because I adopted a new structure for my speeches, and it was something that helped me with the judges in those rounds and stuff like that. But now to get into a little bit more deeper analysis, like I think that, now we've sort of dissolved this notion of it being an absolute question. I think there's definitely degrees because, right. I definitely think that people are born more so than made. Obviously, they're both factors, but I think that, when you have, a lot of times when you have a good speaker, it's that their brain is wired in such a way that these strategies come easily to them. Either they just do it naturally or they can learn them very, very easily. Whereas not a lot of people necessarily are like that. And that, what it is, I think that great speakers are definitely born because, similar to how people have different talents, like, how Einstein, he was born with these talents at math and science, right. How Socrates and Plato were born with great intelligence, like, how you have, how basketball players, people in right. the NBA, they're born tall. That people have certain talents, and I think that speaking is just one of those talents that certain people have. And while anybody can become a better speaker than they were before, when we're talking about truly great speakers, it's almost universally people who are talented at speaking, people who are sort of born for it, and that they might have used certain educational aspects to take their speaking to the next level.
On that point, I think the best formula for this to note is that we're not saying that anybody can't become a good speaker. We're just saying that good speakers, some people are born good speakers. But if you incorporated these elements or this little instruction that me and Preston are going to explore, a good speaker who does these practices can become a great speaker. Versus a good speaker who doesn't do these will just become a good speaker, and a bad speaker who incorporates these styles can become a good speaker.
Exactly.
So you can sort of level up from wherever you are. You can improve. It's just your base level for improvement and might be sort of fixed. But even if that's the case, there are instances where, whether through sheer will or through sheer determination, that you can overcome even the most seamlessly unlimited obstacles. Now, there was a case where the best Greek orator of ancient Greece was Demosthenes. Okay, now he was the person that he saw that King Philip of Macedon was coming to give battle to them. He saw King Macedon conquering Thebes and areas around Greece, and the Greek people didn't want to do nothing. They didn't want to fight. They were scared. So he was the one who sort of got them to organize and then put up infantry and build a navy and got them to defend their country. Now, a lot of people don't know that Demosthenes was born with a speech impediment. He was born with a limited range of skills that we would call that are natural skills, but he was so determined that he took upon himself like a 1 year where he went to the woods. He went to a cave, right? He went to a cave. He wanted to sort of work on becoming a better orator, and he didn't do anything else. He was in this cave, and every day he would try to practice speaking, and because he had a speech impediment, he put rocks in his mouth. So he tried to train his style of speaking. You can do the same thing by putting a pen in your mouth. You need to put a pen. You talk like this a little bit, and you do that. And so there are ways to overcome even natural obstacles, like Demosthenes did when he did this. And because he spent so much intensive training on becoming a better orator, he was able to even overcome orators with natural gift and who had worked at it just through because he just wasn't going to let this get him down, and that he wanted to make sure that he was the best. Now, another thing that I can say is if you do have something like where you just simply can't speak, or if there's something like that, then there are alternatives. You can still write. And I think a lot of the things that apply to the orator applies to the writer.
Yes.
So I would advise you to explore that area. But the majority of people that we're talking about, they have a good baseline. They're able to speak. They're coherent. They have the intellect to incorporate many of these styles and become great in their craft of speaking.
Well, and one thing I'll kind of tack on to that is that, and that's why really my initial answer was as a combination of both, because while I do agree that it's more natural talent than these techniques, that obviously they both feed into one another, and that one can overcome the other if it's to a sufficient degree. That you could have somebody who never ever practices speaking or thinks about any of these techniques who's good if they're just naturally an amazing speaker, whereas with the example you just gave, it can also be the opposite, that that one in a massive degree can compensate for the other, and that's similar to how a lot of natural talent can overcome someone not paying attention to rhetorical techniques. That somebody who practices rhetorical techniques endlessly can definitely overcome certain natural limitations, and that I think that it's important to not just look at this as only from a perspective of the extremes. That obviously in both natural talent and in how hard you work at it, that there's a range of things, and that that anybody can improve or be a better speaker than they were before, and that when you work really hard at it, or maybe if your natural difficulties were only slight, or you spend a lot of time when you're practicing, that kind of stuff, there are definitely ways around it. I think that when we're talking about characteristics and which of the two approaches is more effective in developing a great speaker, it really has to do, I think, with how easy it is to overcome, where people start, how likely are you to get success, how much do you need to work to get to that, because somebody who's a naturally great speaker could probably get to that point easily, whereas when you start with a speech impediment, it takes lots of practice to become someone like that.
All right, Preston, so I think that we've laid that down. I think we solved that problem of whether this is innate or whether someone can improve. And I would urge anybody who's listening to this to try to seek to improve, regardless of what we say. The goal is to always try to improve yourself. So with that note, Preston, we have here the 5 canons of rhetoric, and we don't have to stick to this, but when we're building our orator, one of the main things that he has to be able to do is he has to be able to do the most easy step, which is, well, not the easiest step, but the most obvious step, which is, what do I say? What do I say? How do I come up with the words? That process is called invention, and that is like before a Supreme Court justice, gives his speech, he has to be able to take in all the arguments, and he has to bring it together, and then filter that through his own reasoning, and then sort of come up with something that's that sort of is a result of that process. And so, what process do you go through when you invent? For me, there's people who they can just do it right there. They just type, like they just write something, or they say something and they edit it while they're speaking. And there's also people who prepare statements, who just have bullet points in their head that they want to say, and then they just go through the structure and do it that way. But let's just say you're giving a speech. Let's say you have a great speech to give. How are you going to invent that speech? What is the process you're going to use to make sure that you have the right words?
Well, there's kind of a 2-part process that I go through that kind of incorporates both of the things that you talked about. Preparing things beforehand, but also how you mentioned how a lot of people can just come up with stuff on the fly. I think both of those are important, and what the most effective orators a lot of times do, and what I always follow when I'm trying to prepare a speech, is a combination of both. And I think the starting point, kind of going first with the prepared approach, the starting point of any speech is you need to have an argument. That there has to be a cause or a philosophy or an ideology or something. It can be broad or specific, a goal that you want to achieve. That there sort of has to be an objective for the speech, and you have to have in your head the argument behind it. Now, the reason why I talk about how it's also important to adapt, and the reason why I say that both parts of those are equally valid, and I use half and half when I'm developing speeches, is because when you're in front of an audience, to communicate effectively, you need to be able to read that audience. There have been times where I've been speaking to a group of people, who the way they reacted to certain rhetoric, the group of people that the groups that they came from might have been a little bit different than I expected. And that when that happens, you can't just go off a scripted speech, and you have to have that ability whether it's born or learned, to just come up with stuff on the fly,
Right.
in order to be able to satisfy different interests or to kind of move along with the moods of the crowd, because a lot of speaking is about emotion, and that, in order to have an argument that ties into that well, you have to be able to kind of partner those two things together, and that you need to read the crowd. But reading the crowd and understanding how people feel,
Right.
observing how different rhetorical strategies are reacted to, that's something that's done in the moment.
Those things are well, true, and valid, Preston, and I think that anybody has to be able to, have those two components. But what I want to really get at is not the sort of while you're speaking and how you handle the speed bumps of speaking, of being in an actual real-time environment of where things are changing and there's a lot of noise, of all kinds that you have to deal with. But I guess I should have been a little bit more specific here. When I say invention, I mean coming up, and you did touch on this by having an objective and having a mission and having a reason and having an argument. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is here, not the actual speech, but writing the speech. So this is like pre-speaking, like, because when you're speaking, that's the actual, that you're actually doing the speaking. But I mean like how you write the speech, like what process do you have when you're actually writing a speech? This actually doesn't even fall under speaking, but obviously you're going to have to speak what you're writing.
Yeah.
So it's an important step that you can't be neglected.
Yeah.
And so is there anything that you noticed that helps that process of actually writing the speech?
Well, one thing that definitely helps for me is, kind of going off what I had said towards the beginning. First of all, that when you want to make sure you have strong arguments, you want to get your evidence together. You want to get together what it is that you want to say. Like I said, what your objective is. Another thing that helps is you definitely want to try to anticipate things. Like you want to think about counter arguments. And that after you do your research and you have your argument together, you really have to think about, how am I going to say this in a way that's going to be well received, and that people aren't just going to immediately dismiss that. And that thinking about some of the other side, that can help you strengthen your argument sometimes. When you're trying to develop what your message is going to be, you really have to make sure that it's airtight. You really have to make sure that what you're saying makes sense, and that what you're saying is not just relying on false assumptions. And that, when you're trying to put these ideas together, the first step is making sure that you have something that's sound. That it has to be, the analogy that I would use is like, building the foundation. Like the foundation of your speech is what you're saying. Nothing else matters if you don't have anything to say or if you don't know what you're saying. You have to know what you're saying first. And that step requires, getting together arguments that make sense, that are strong, that you can present, that are relevant to the topic that you have chosen to speak about, etc.
Okay, yeah. I would say that, a couple important things here are when you're giving a speech, you have to know what it's for. So, most speeches are to persuade, to sort of advocate for a course of action, while others are just simply informal. And for both of those, you still need to do the same thing, which you sort of touched on, which I just want to sort of highlight a little bit, is information. So you never want to go into a speaking situation where you haven't done your homework and actually researched the topic that you're speaking on, or sort of done the intensive, work that it takes to actually acquire the knowledge to know exactly what you're talking about, and to sound confident and have that conviction that this is true. You have the evidence to back it up. You've done all of your homework. You've taken in all the information and you processed it, and you're giving it in either an argumentative form or an informative form. And the second thing, that once you have that information, that you need to do is be cognizant of your audience, and that is, if your audience is college educated, or if they're students, or if they're old people, or if they're of a certain demographic background, then you want to make sure that you're catering your speech to them in any way that you can. Like if you're in Idaho State University, you want to give a reference to something that has to do with Idaho State.
Yeah.
That sort of, those little tricks and tips in your inventions can help give you the ear of that reader. And also, when you're inventing, you always want to have like a toolbox of things, like quotes that you want to throw in there, or stories that you might want to put in there to sort of highlight your point, or just general lessons, general maxims that are true in any case, and sort of have a toolbox that you can put in there in your invention. Now, obviously, there's so many things that go into this invention process, but this is the most creative part, to me, of the whole thing. And it's like you're creating from nothing, basically. To me, it's the most interesting part, and that invention is so special. But I think if you follow these little things that me and Preston highlighted, and then you also, just come up with some things in your own, invention. I mean, we could talk about, forever.
And one just last thing I was going to say, and this kind of just came to mind. One other thing I think is very important, because you mentioned the creative aspect. I think that's really important. You have to be unique. That no matter how well you apply some of these other things we're about to talk about, people are less likely to be interested in something they've heard before. If you sound just like everyone else, even if you present it better than anyone did, people are not going to want to listen to you. When you're in this invention stage, when you're thinking about what you want to say, it's important. You got to think about, what do I have to offer that's new? And it could be, if it's informative, it could be some new facts that you've discovered. If it's persuasive, it could be a new perspective or a new philosophy. It could even be a combination of both, because you might have a speech that has elements of both. But regardless, you really want to get that creativity going, because it helps you be unique. That uniqueness is very important. People like to hear things that are new. People like to hear something that they haven't heard before, and that you as a speaker want to make sure that you're standing out and that you're bringing something to the table that other speakers simply cannot when it comes to your idea.
And I think a lot of people hear that and they get a little bit, troubled and concerned that, oh, I'm not creative, or, oh, how can I be unique, because I just want to, be like somebody else, or they did it, why can't I just do it like them? But I think that a lot of people need to realize that they have the ability to be unique, because everyone is unique.
Yeah.
Every person has their own experiences. Everyone has their own, understanding of the world, and that is what you should tap into when Preston says being, unique and sort of having your own style, is that you should tap into your sort of uniqueness as a person. And one way that you can do that is incorporate your emotions into your speech. Now, you don't want to do this to a fault. There's obviously a balance that you have to strike here. But one thing that I hear, that how they generally put it, is speaking from the heart. So when you speak from the heart, when you tap into that heart, how do you feel about this issue? Not only at an intellectual aspect, but from the heart. How does this issue affect you? And the best speakers that I see, they speak from the heart. They construct their arguments from the heart. It isn't just syllogisms and logic the whole time. There's a heart component. So I'm glad that you brought that up, so we can incorporate that. But I would like to move on to sort of the next important thing that I think we're going to is let's go for arrangement here. So arrangement. Now, obviously, you want to have your attention getter. You want to have something that sort of gets the audience, like a joke or or a quote or something that just reels the audience in. It's not too serious. You don't want to just go in and say, diplomatic structure of the United States in the United Nations. You kind of want to give a brief overview or something like that. And then you got to have, your bodies and your thesis. You want to have your, just your different aspects of structure. And I think, Preston, you could knock this one out of the park here with your experience in the LBJ Debate Society. And sort of talking about what is a good structure to follow when you're giving a speech.
So the first thing that I will say, kind of going off, and I'm not going to go back to invention, I just think there's something that we said that's applicable to this. That I think that a lot of times how you arrange something is going to depend on your audience a lot, and the type of speech that you're giving. Because I think that, when you're talking about the how you organize the speech, what order you present your ideas in, is it structured or is it spontaneous or somewhere in between? A lot of times it's going to depend on what specific situation. So, for example, if you're giving sort of an informal speech where, you're with friends, and then you start talking about politics, and then you get fired up, and then you go up there and you have this message, you can be a little bit looser, that you can be kind of all over the place, because if it's in an informal setting and that's what people are expecting, and if that's the style of communication that's been used, that's the style of communication that's going to appeal to that audience, and you can do that. Whereas when you get to more of a formal setting, and this kind of where the LGBTJ Debate Society stuff comes in, that's when you want to have speeches that are a lot more structured.
Right.
And that's when you want to make sure that how you order things is more clear. So like what we'll do in Extemp, for example, that we have an intro, so we have an attention-getting device, then we have a link, we have something that we say like why that's relevant to the topic. We explain some background information. We talk about why it's significant. Then we state the question, because in Extemp, it's a topic where you give a speech about over a question. Then you answer it, and then you give an outline. And this is something that's really important, in these type of very formal and structured speeches, that you want to give sort of a roadmap in some way of what you're going to talk about. And then in Extemp, we continue with 3 solid points, and then we end up concluding. Now, obviously, that's only one structure that can be used, but a lot of the same wisdom can be applied to other areas, and that how you organize it, can kind of depend on the topic. So, you always want to have some things are universal. Like you always want to have an attention-getting device. But like if it's sort of a logical speech, kind of like how extemp is, or if you're in a debate round or something, you want to maybe go point by point. Whereas if it's more of giving a speech in front of a crowd, for political reasons, maybe you want to incorporate more emotion in there, have a narrative to it, tie in a story with that speech, and that, arranging it is something that, how you arrange the speech really is going to be dependent on your audience. But once you do it, you have to make sure that you're consistent, that you want to stick to the style. Whether you're doing the informal speech that I talked about where you're all over the place, whether you're doing a formal argumentative speech like extemp, or whether you're getting more into the emotional aspect, giving kind of a political speech, you want to make sure that you're consistent and that you follow that. That way you're able to stay with the audience, because ultimately the reason why we have these arrangement choices in the first place is because we want to make sure that we're communicating to our audience effectively.
I think that when you want to talk about arrangement, it's important that you sort of have a set idea in your head. Now, regardless if it's the structure that we're talking about or the structure that you've made up, but it's just important to stick to that arrangement. That's just the important thing. It's just to have your speech arranged in some kind of way. I don't think there's any perfect way to do it. Like you said, depending on the type of speech in the audience, then that's what you want to go for. But some of the arrangements that I see that are more interesting, and what a lot of speakers, a lot of statesmen do, is like they do build-up speeches to where they're building up to a certain point, where the emotions just seem to sort of rise and rise and rise and rise, and then they hit you with their claim or their main point, and then once they have you, then they sort of move into arguments. And now one of the ways that you can do that is the way you arrange something is to have the main point, your main argument, and then develop that with sort of three other arguments. Like you can have an argument of why, like if you're doing a speech on, let's say, whether you should raise the minimum wage or something. Now, I'm not necessarily for it or against it. I'm just using it as an example. But I think that you could then arrange your arguments in a way that you can use an example in the real world. You can use an example of something that another country does. You can use an argument about, about something that we've done in the past that hasn't worked. Or you can do an argument. You can do sort of a straw man argument. If that's your thing. Like there's other arguments that you can make there. But I think that like when you arrange something, you obviously want to have your main header, and then you want to have things that follow that header. Your sort of your different arguments, and then your conclusion, and where you get back to that header.
It's that reminds me of something I forgot to mention. That because you touched on it a little bit when you talk about your header and your main argument. But I think you can take it a little bit further in some cases, especially if you have like a metaphor to the speech. It's good to have something you can go back to, especially when you're dealing with audiences like the general public. Like if you're dealing with a bunch of professors, you might want to take a more argumentative approach. But if you are a politician up there on a stage giving a speech, it's good. People like repetition. When people hear something over and over, when you have a narrative that you can keep going back to, it's good. And a perfect example of this is one time, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, he's known as definitely one of the better speakers that we've had, and a lot of his speeches were very persuasive. And one thing I remember was there was a speech he gave, we're going to build a bridge to the 21st century. Because this was, nearing the turn of the millennium, and that was something he was using as a rhetorical device. And in the speech, he talked about all sorts of these different points. He talked about economics, he talked about social issues, etc. But every time he concluded, he said, we're going to build a bridge to the 21st century. And that people can visualize that. They can think about that there's a 21st century over there. And if we build this bridge, we can get there. If we build this bridge, we can get there, and it's going to be good. That things are going to be better than they were before, and we can reach it without any problems. But if he had just said that once, he could have lost people. But no, he made it a recurring theme throughout the speech. Every time he talked about something that was important, every time he concluded a major point, we are going to build a bridge to the 21st century.
Right, and obviously the point of having arrangement is to give your speech the maximum impact that it can have, so that what you said either gets, if it's call for action, it sort of gets done, that people want to do it, or whether it's an informative topic that the people understand what you're talking about. So that's the importance of arrangement. And if you have a good arrangement, like Preston said, you can incorporate that skill. It worked very good for Bill Clinton, that sort of type of arrangement. But the next thing that we want to get into, and I know we're pressed for time. How much more time do we have here? 12 minutes? 13 minutes?
We have about 11 minutes.
About 11 minutes left? Okay. And so I want to get into the most fun part of talking, and that is delivery. So that is actually how you speak, your tone inflections, whether you're speaking loud or you're speaking soft, very soft. That's the way that you want to do it. And I think a lot of these things, they sort of affect the listener in so many different ways. You know, you can deliver with your hand gestures. You can make these big, loud movements, or you can pound the table if you're trying to make a powerful statement. I mean, the speech in itself isn't just the words. Like the majority of the speech, or a good portion of the speech, is how you deliver that speech. Whether you look confident, whether you're competent, or whether you're doing the oohs and ums and ahs. You know, delivery is just such a huge, important part of speaking. I mean, like some people, they don't even have to be saying anything necessarily intelligent or convincing. If the way that they speak is just it's just a pleasure to listen to them, then you sort of account them as a great speaker, even if their substance of speaking isn't really what we would see as, you know, as good or merit.
I think my example of Hitler was a perfect example of that. That he was somebody, you know, who he was able to take this racist idea. And, you know, I'm going to use a metaphor here. You could say, you know, it was shit, right? Mm-hmm. But he was able to convince people that this was the greatest shit ever, that this shit was amazing, that this shit the best, that nobody has ever had better shit than this shit, and that this shit will conquer the world. You see what I'm saying? And that's basically what he was able to do, you know, and that, well, and I know what you mean, but, you know, kind of going back to the types of speeches we want to have, you know, fighting for narratives that are good and that are positive. Like, I think style, the first thing, there's a couple things that come to mind for me when it comes to this aspect. The first thing is, well, obviously the audience, but with that, it's kind of like, you know, you got to read the audience. That's kind of an in the moment thing. When you're thinking about what kind of style you want to use sort of ahead of time, the first thing is important. You need to think about the setting. You know, if you're speaking at a funeral, you know, it's going to be somber. Whereas if you're speaking at a political rally, you know, especially if it's a big issue, you want to be out there, you want to, you know, be, you know, fired up, you want to be powerful. But the other thing that's important, I think, is being able to have variation in style. Because power is great. You know, being somber is great. Humor is great. You know, being proud, you know, talking about the achievements that you've had, you know, are great. You know, but the thing is that any one of those things just by themselves, especially over the duration of a very long speech, gets old. You know, if you just got one guy, like with power, you got one guy up there, he's just shouting at the top of his lungs for 30 minutes.
Can't stand those
You can't
guys.
stand it. Whereas, you know, if you got somebody and they're just, you know, like they start with a sad topic and then they're talking about happy things and they still sound like this, that's not funny either. But if you have that variation.
Get that guy out of here.
Yeah, but if you have that variation, you have a guy who's able to start off nostalgically and then maybe get sad and talk about, you know, how we've lost that, but then get fired up and talk about how we don't have to go back to the past, that the future can be better, that we can forge our way ahead, you know, and get that power going, and then maybe calm things down a little bit and talk about, you know, things in a more logical and calm setting, you know, maybe drop a joke here and there, you know, talk, you know, maybe make something that's funny. You know, having that variation is important, and it's a good way to enhance the effectiveness of the delivery of your message, because different parts of your message are going to have different styles that are better suited, you know, for each one. That, you know, you might want to emphasize things that are very, very important points, whereas you might want to calm down a little bit when you're transitioning, or you might want to seem sort of, you know, humorous or sarcastic when you're talking about what, say, maybe political opposition is saying, you know, that there's different things that you want to incorporate, and you want to reflect the different aspects of your message by varying your style.
I think that's an important sort of, when you talk about, you know, the sort of tone that you're speaking, your highs and lows, and what it brings to mind is like music, you know. It's like if you can speak in a way that has rhythm. Really, the best speakers that I know, they do it. They don't talk in these long sentences, you know, these fragments where everything just doesn't seem to fit. They sort of have this perfect cadence. It's like you can almost time them, you know, like that, like a measurement, and you know what they're saying. And when they do that, like when they use long sentences, and then short sentences. It just sort of accents each other, and they just find that perfect rhythm and that perfect that balance that sort of allows them to empower their message. Now, to me, I think delivery is probably the most important, because what's a good speech if you can't deliver it? It's the most impactful part. And delivery, whether your speech is good, is determined upon the delivery, because that sort of makes the listener, understand it or disregard it. And I think that, when you're talking about delivery, the thing that you want to do is accent almost every single word that you're saying, to sort of have in your mind an idea of, like, if you're going to talk about destruction, you want to emphasize the word destruction. Or if you want to talk about the Lord and all of his might, you want to sort of focus on that word. Those sort of things are powerful. Or you can do it the opposite way, like if you want to highlight the troubles and the tribulations and the negative circumstances that always seem to follow the weak. You can do it that way. So you always have a word or the words, it could be basically every word in your sentence, but you want to make sure that if it's something that is central to that sentence or central to that idea, that you sort of emphasize that word to sort of get the best effect. You don't just sort of neglect your words, because, be nice to your words, people. That's all I'm trying to say.
Well, and you think about, like, and I'm going to, one example I'm going to kind of use is, like, if you're talking about maybe a group that's oppressed and how you want to fight for their rights, for example. When you're I'll kind of give an example. Like, you think about, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree, because obviously, we're not trying to get partisan. But, like, if I'm up there and I'm advocating for immigrants' rights, like, think about this. I could say, for too long, our immigrant population has been oppressed.
Right.
Our government has abused its power against them. And he speaks some more, and I said, but today we rise up, like that you have those different inflections that, you're kind of going down, you kind of feel downtrodden when you're talking about the oppression, but then when you're at that no more part, you're like, no, this ends now. We will stand up to the government and we will fight for the liberties of this population. We will ensure that they are equally protected. You see that then you can have more of an upbeat narrative. You want to be sad and kind of downtrodden when you're talking about the problem, but you want to be fired up and happy when you're talking about how you're going to fix it and why the future is going to be better than the past was.
Now, one of the things that seems to cut across all of these steps, Preston, is emotion, and really that's a huge part of the human experience. We're all emotional. If we hear something in a minor, pentatonic, it's going to make us feel sad. Versus if we hear some upbeat, some rock and roll music, we're going to feel energetic. It's just natural. We're susceptible to that, to a fault, even, I would say. But what are some of the emotions that a good speaker wants to sort of extract from their listener? What are some of the things that a Hitler or a Martin Luther King, that they utilized, that they directed their words to get this specific response out of their people? And if I can just give it a first crack at it, I would say the number one thing that you want to do, especially for a statesman, or even if you're trying to speak in front of a judge or something, or flatter somebody, or get people to sort of become on your side, is you want to speak to their sense of pride. Yes. I think that pride is an emotion that, it's very strong, and I think that when you're going for emotions, you're going for strong emotions, whether they're good or bad. You want to get a good mix in there, but strong emotions to me seem to be the best over even complex emotions too. But so getting someone proud, whether that's, if you're speaking to Americans, then you're obviously going to talk about that time that our soldiers faced innumerable odds when they invaded the island of Iwo Jima, and that island was fortified for 3 years, and we didn't think that we were going to take it. And then finally, there's that image of the 4 U.S. Marines lifting that flag on that mountain. I mean, those sort of images sort of appeal to your pride, and and they're strong.
Like me, every time I see that picture, it hits me. When I see that picture, it makes me proud to be an American.
It makes you proud to be an American.
Like, you see that, and you're like, damn it, our country did this.
We're great.
That we were able to overcome such huge obstacles, that we were able to fight and win when the odds were against us.
So basically, if you can, with your words, do that same thing, create that image that is equal to the Iwo Jima picture, but you're doing it not in a photograph, you're doing it in words, then you can get that sort of response out of people, to sort of help you along your way and help you achieve the mission of your speech. Also, I think something that needs to be used, but you need to be careful in how you use it, is anger, because there is such thing as rightful indignation. Jesus himself, the man who never committed any sin, had there's a scene where in the Bible where he goes to one of the big synagogues in Jerusalem.
The temple. What was happening.
The temple where the great fathers had set up, and then in there they have a market, so they're changing monies, and this temple of God became a place where they made money. And so what did Jesus saw that he was angry, and he lifted up the tables and he threw the coins everywhere, and all the poor people came in and got all the money. But the point I'm trying to make is that anger, righteous indignation is something that's important. So if you're speaking to somebody and they're obviously clearly in the wrong, like if you're a counsel and you're talking about someone who's murdered somebody, it's okay to sort of say, this person has taken away the livelihood, the companion of my defendant, of my client. That person shouldn't be allowed in society. Are you going to let that person be available so that he might kill your companion and just build up anger and resentment towards that person? I think in politics, it's a lot of ways, because there are a lot of evil politicians, and if you're speaking, it's okay to sort of invoke a sense of hatred.
And it kind of goes back to the topic a little, because I think that anger is particularly useful when you're trying to give a speech to fight against things like injustice or corruption.
Right.
That what it is, that when you see something that on an ethical level is clearly wrong, if you see something happening that's illegal, maybe if you see something happening that's unfair, that you can get people angry. It's like, look, this is not fair. Why does this have to happen? This is not right. You can get them mad, and you can get people angry. Like if you're dealing with something, just random issue from history, like segregation or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you could get people pissed off about how one group of people is treated so poorly, where another is treated so well. It'd be like, no, this is not right. You should be angry about this. Why are we tolerating this? And that anger is definitely a very important tool when you're on that topic, especially, because if people are able to get angry, if people are able to be frustrated, that they say we need to do something about this injustice, then that is going to motivate them to take the type of action that's needed. Whereas if they feel complacent and they're kind of calm and mellow, they might just walk away and then go back to their lives.
Right. And so the only reason why, we understand obviously that those things can be used both ways. You can get people to hate through a racist way or in a genocidal way, and that can create destruction and chaos in society. So we just want to emphasize that what we're advocating for is righteous indignation.
Yeah. Well, that's why
where you're mad at evil. You can't stand evil.
Well, and that's why you correctly point out in the beginning that anger is a tricky one, because it can be dangerous. That what it is, that anger inherently, while it can be good in some instances, like we just talked about, it's inherently an emotion that makes people willing to do things that they otherwise would not. Oftentimes anger and violence go hand in hand, and while you might have instances where it's justified, you also have instances where anger can lead to unjustified violence, unjustified resistance, and that things can escalate very quickly when anger is involved. So it is, and I do agree, you have to be very careful with anger, and that's why I think it's something that's more effective in certain types of speeches than others, that you can't use it all the time, because if you do, it can be a dangerous thing.
Now I just want to say, for those of you who are out there who actually buy the argument of, you need to have a high sense of morality, in life in general, I would say that there is, like Martin Luther King that we talked about, he didn't use hate. You don't need to use hate. If you're uncomfortable with it, if you don't like it, if you just think it's intrinsically bad, you don't need to do it, and you can still get the results. We're just offering this out there as something you can put in your toolkit. Now, the next thing that I think is better than hate, but it's what Martin Luther King actually used, and that's hope.
Yes.
I think that hope
that was actually the first thing that came to mind for me, is hope.
Is one of the strongest emotions that you can get out, because a hope, what that does is it allows people to dream. And when it allows people to dream, it allows them to see your vision, and it allows them to work towards it, because they feel like it's possible, that it's in the realm of reality if you just work towards it. And, obviously what I think of is, like, the founders had this, they always spoke of a land of liberty, the land of opportunity, this free land, and Martin Luther King, he had a dream, and he gave people this hope of a society in the future that wouldn't be held down by the chains of the oppressions of the minorities and of the chaos that was going on in society. And JFK, when he gave people the hope that in that century they were going to land a man on the moon, it just, when you invoke that hope, it's always for a good cause. To me, it just seems to be always conducive to human achievement. It always leads humans to a certain point, and it makes people feel good. When people feel hopeful, like if the employment rate is 20%, and then I made you feel hopeful that I can get it down to 10%. Everyone's going to go home feeling good. Everyone's going to, and it's one of those emotions that just makes people feel good. And if you can give someone hope, it's a very beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think another thing that's really important is that this is something that's really important when it comes to actually having your goals realized. I think one of the things that makes hope so strong is that it's one of those few things that's able to unite the idealists and the pragmatists. Because when you really think about it, like the man on the moon is a perfect example. That there's always a friction between idealism and pragmatism. Because when you're an idealist, you're prone to pursuing things that are not realistic. Whereas if you're purely a pragmatist, you might not dream. The thing is that when you're speaking like this, it helps get the pragmatists motivated to do something. And the reason why I think the moon landing is a perfect example of this is because previous to that, nobody had ever really thought about that, But in the end of the day, it was the engineers and the scientists who made that rocket. It wasn't JFK. JFK could not have done that, especially not by himself. But what it is that when you have those two things combined, when you have that idealist inspiring people, JFK saying that we need to go to the moon, then he phrased it as a challenge, and that the pragmatists, knowing that it was in the best interest to advance the national prestige and stuff, accepted the challenge, and then were able to put their talents and skills to use in ways that previously were thought not possible. And I think that's very important, because when you can get the idealists and the pragmatists to work together, where you sort of have that cycle going, where you're idealistic enough to keep people inspired, but pragmatic enough to make sure that things are actually happening, that is how you move a society forward.
That's what moves people forward, ladies and gentlemen, and that gives us all something to hope for. Now, the last thing that I want to point out, because we got to wrap this up, is any speech. The great speeches that I have noticed, you need to sort of talk about courage and bravery. You have to sort of, like Winston Churchill did this, like in times of war, the people can feel sad, or the people can feel disaffected, or the people can feel disillusioned, and they won't take the necessary action in order to improve themselves and improve the lot of the country if they don't have the necessary bravery and they don't have the courage. And I think that that's something that is, when you're asking people to do something, a call of action, you have to give them that sense of confidence that comes with courage and bravery. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things when you're telling somebody you can do it. Have no fear. I think courage and bravery is a lot of times the absence of fear. It's like when JFK said, "Let us not negotiate out of fear, but let us not negotiate to fear." He's basically talking about having the courage to stand up to the Soviet Union. And in today's day, what a lot of people might get the national sense that China has become a global dominating superpower, and that it becomes inevitable that they're going to have to submit to the will, the political will, the diplomatic will of the Chinese at a certain point, because they are just growing and growing and growing. And if that's the case, there will be no challenge. So what a good speaker does is they ignite the population with bravery and courage, so that they take it upon themselves to challenge that superpower in realms across these competitive realms. And I think to do that is good for the nation's health. It's good for the person. It's good for the speech. It's just something that is something that should be cultivated.
Well, and I think that the absence of fear is something that helps us be more logical, because that quote that you just shared, we must not negotiate out of fear, however we must never fear to negotiate. That is one of my favorite quotes, and the reason for that is because it shows that fear oftentimes is the enemy of us thinking clearly, and that a lot of times with these debates, both hawks and doves have a tendency to act out of fear. Because think about with the China example that you have, that fear can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Some people, it seems like the trend
it
that
paralyzes people.
Yeah, the trend sometimes fear paralyzes people, where that they'll be like, oh well, we can't do anything because we might start a trade war. We can't do anything because we might provoke China. Negotiating out of fear. Oh my God, we're so afraid of China. Whereas on the other hand, sometimes hawks have their own version of fear, that they're like, we need to attack because if we don't, this and that and this and that could happen. What it is that by having an absence of fear, it gives you enough courage to stand up to the threat. It's like, no, we're not appeasing China. We're going to hold them to the same international law standards in any other country. We're going to protect our interests, but at the same time remain prudent enough not to become paranoid. That, yes, China overall is a great power competitor. I would argue that they're the most dangerous country to the United States right now. But every now and then you might have a particular interest where there is some room for cooperation, and that you can't fear to take advantage of those areas for cooperation. So I think that fear is something that paralyzes and harms people across the board, and that both dovish and hawkish ideology oftentimes manifest it. And I think regardless of where you fall on the ideological spectrum, oftentimes avoiding fear is very important. That a speech that can inspire people to do that, a speech that can inspire people to confront and put aside their fears, it's like, no, we can stand up to China if you're trying to convince doves to do something. Or, no, there's some room for cooperation if you're trying to convince the hawks to not be as extreme. That absence of fear can get people to think clearly and produce solutions that actually work, rather than out of paranoia doing something crazy like appeasement on one hand or starting World War III on the other.
And a lot of times where courage and bravery come into a central play is that where you're advocating for something that has long odds or that seems like it's not possible. I mean, you can just imagine the courage that it would take an abolitionist to have, in the early 18th century, 19th century, that you're going against long odds. And obviously, like if you're an immigrant right now and you're speaking to your fellow immigrants, they could be persecuted or deported. It's important to instill them with speech so that they're not paralyzed towards the necessary action that's going to bring out the outcome. And obviously, if you're going into battle, that general has to give his troops the courage so that they fight, so that they can take that hill, so that they can take that battle, so that they can take that region and win the war. So I think that, and I'm going to end the emotion aspect of this right now, but Preston, I think we did a good job.
Yeah, I agree, order. But I think we've reached a good stopping point. It was a very good conversation. I feel like both of us brought up a lot of good points. And yeah, I enjoyed it, and I hope that anyone who listens to this got a lot out of it, that we were able to discuss some of the aspects of communication that really, truly make a great speaker. And as we continue with this, we're going to, after we kind of get through all these principles, we're going to be thinking about, like, okay, in our opinion, we're going to construct a speaker. We're going to make a hypothetical person. We're going to say, what that's like. So anyway, that's about time, and we're heading out.
All right, the last thing I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, is this is a production of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society, and this is what we do constantly every week. Every Wednesday we have meetings, and we come to discuss ideas, just like how me and Preston did. We think that we're big on trying to find solutions to the problems that we see in society, and we're big on looking through the literature and finding the knowledge of the past and sort of coming up with ideas to solve problems in the status quo. But what else could you say about the Wisdom Factory real quick? What are some of the things that we try to do here, Preston?
Well, I think really the core objective of the Wisdom Factory is just trying to advance the human condition through the discovery of truth and the development of knowledge. That basically what we want to do and what we are doing is we're trying to make sure that we have an openness about these ideas, that we're discussing them, that we're having debates and discussions to make sure that we are able to develop things and develop ideas that make humankind, as a whole, make our country, our communities a better place. That we want to strive forward, and we want to make sure that we're tackling some of these issues and challenges in ways that are productive, that produce good solutions, that lead to the discovery of truth, and that leave everybody better off than they were before.
Exactly, and I like the way you said that, leave everybody off the way that they were before. And also, one of the big things that we do is that, and then the next component is self-development. So we're hopefully those listening to us can incorporate some of the things that we talked about and build themselves up and become a better speaker. And the fact, if anybody here listening to this became a better speaker, then that's actually, one of the main things that we're about. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. And if you want any more information, please don't hesitate to contact somebody in the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. Thank you for your time.